This topic is going to be about a quick hit on erosion control methods. So I'm going to go through a lot, and hopefully I can get through all of it because I know this is one of my longer modules. I'm just going to hit upon the different aspects out there. There's going to be some items that you're going to scratch your head over and say, why are you even introducing that? We don't do that here. But again, I'd rather give you information that you just kind of tuck in the back of your mind and just maybe it stays there rather than leave holes or blanks in it. So, talking about erosion. If you sat with me during the very first session, I made the comment that I tend to kind of nitpick a little bit in terms of terminology. I feel like at this day and age, at this point in time, with as many years of regulatory requirements and updates that we have gone through, we should have the terminology down correctly in terms of what is sediment, what is erosion, what is sedimentation, and how they differ. I just still see to this day too much incorrect usage of the terminology. So I just threw up here the definition of water erosion there, and it's basically those soil particles displaced by the action of wind or water. And here you guys deal predominantly with precipitation, although I know it can get very windy and it's something to be aware of on your sites. The HAR, which Appendix C, which I know is a big guiding documentation for you guys, it's the permit for any of your sites that have to be permitted under this, has a little section in there talking about stabilization. And to me, it's an important one to be aware of. And it's important to understand what some of the information is telling you and what the terminology is in. So if you're familiar with it, you might have it memorized. Or at least know what I'm talking about. Under 5.2.1.1, it talks about the deadline to initiate stabilization. And so I'm going to go into a little more detail on this. I'm going to kind of break this down and tell you about a couple of the deadlines, the time frames and what it all means. So the deadlines for initiating stabilization. And to me, erosion control is a big aspect and very important on a construction site. But I always take the stance as well that we are trying to build something, whether it's a roadway, whether it's a bridge, whether it's subdivision, commercial, industrial, whatever, and we got to recognize that aspects of that are going to require just nothing but sediment control. We got to move the soil. We got to build it. We can't be going in, and just putting nothing but erosion control, because unfortunately we're going to redisturb it. But the portion of this that is critical is the fact that there are time frames that we have to be aware of, though, for starting to implement that erosion control, because it is big. It is going to help reduce and minimize the sediment leaving from the site. But we have to just be aware that construction is going to cause a lot of disturbance. We're going to rely so heavily on sediment control, but we have to keep this in the back of our mind that there are these guidelines. So, earth disturbing activities permanently cease. So basically what we're saying is that where clearing and excavation will not include a permanent structure and it has permanently ceased, we have to immediately begin stabilization practices. I'll tell you what immediately means in just a couple bullets here. But think about that. Immediately. All right? Second one, earth disturbing activities temporarily cease. So again, clearing and excavation will not resume for 14 or more calendar days, not business days, calendar days. Be aware of that. So you have an area where maybe you're leaving that aspect for some reason. It's something that either you need to do an amendment, maybe it's something that has to be just left there until you work on another area. If it's 14 days or more before you're going to be back in that area, you have to temporarily start stabilizing it immediately. So what does immediately mean? Well, immediately means as soon as practical, but no later than the next day. Hopefully this is not something that's a surprise to a lot of you, especially if you're a contractor and have been working with stormwater for a while now. Deadlines for initiating stabilization. Permanently cease, temporarily cease, immediately, no later than the end of the next day. Obviously, they're going to have some allowances and everything, but they're pretty stringent on those requirements. So, deadlines for completing the stabilization. Okay, I just told you that by tomorrow you need to be initializing the stabilization process, but when can you complete it? Well, as soon as practical. I always love the term practical in the stormwater industry. What's practical mean? Well, they give you a little more help. No later than 14 days after initiation. So you have basically 14 days to complete the stabilization. Now, does that mean I need to have my grass growing in 14 days? No. But that means you have to have the hydraulic mulch applied within those 14 days. You have to have the blankets put on the disturbed ground within those 14 days. Maybe it's a hard armoring. That's what that means. Now, like I said, there are exceptions to the deadlines when it's beyond the control of the permittee, but once again, there's not a lot of wiggle room in this. They're not going to accept just any willy-nilly reasoning. It has to be a very valid reason why it's out of the control of the permittee. And then obviously you have to document the circumstances. Okay, criteria for stabilization. Obviously the big one's vegetation. That's the one that's, we try and strive for the most, because the vegetation works very well in holding the soil particulates in place once the biomass becomes established. But there is some criteria for how that vegetation has to be established. It has to have a uniform establishment, meaning we can't have gigantic holes where the vegetation is not germinated. It has to be uniform. You have to have 70% or more of historic vegetation, meaning prior to earth disturbing activities, whatever the vegetation coverage was there, you have to have 70% of it. So if it was like a 95% coverage, you have to have 70% of it. If it was 60% coverage, 70% of it. Okay, so that's what they're looking for. And obviously you'd want a perennial vegetation, something that's going to last year after year. Also, you can a mulch application to go with it to help protect the soil while that vegetation is becoming established. But also they do allow for non-vegetative controls, but they must be effective. So maybe we have a hillside that we end up having to put riprap on. That would be accepted as a stabilization practice. Okay, but it has to be effective. All right, I'm going to just talk briefly. Like I said, hopefully I'm going to get through all of these here. These are some of the different types of erosion control measures that are out there. And hopefully most of them are familiar to you, maybe not terminology, but I'll explain a little bit more if you're not familiar with some. But this is what I'm going to try and go over. So seed and vegetation. Obviously, one of the best aspects to a construction site is phasing or staging. Meaning, we don't go in and open up the whole project all at once and have nothing but bare grounds. Instead, we try and stage it, try and do portions of it as best we possibly can, trying to keep the native vegetation there as long as possible. How well does that work? It works pretty good if you have somebody that is proactive and thinks about the staging prior to putting the plans together. It becomes very difficult when you're standing out there on day one, ready to open up the ground and say, whoops, we need to maybe do some staging here. It becomes a lot more difficult. But it's a great way to actually reduce the erosion potential on a site, and that it reduces the need for sediment control measures. Yes, we will still need sediment control, but instead of putting out 7 miles of silt fence because we opened 7 miles of ground for a highway, if we do it in stages, maybe we have a couple miles. That means we're not having to maintain the rest of that 7 miles. We're only looking at those couple miles instead. So something to think about and be aware of. Establishing vegetation from seed. So I know you guys do a lot of hydromulching here. So we're looking at trying to make sure that we have a viable seed that goes down onto the ground that is going to germinate and work for the area. And I'm just going to throw this up here for some of you if you've come here from the mainland or from different areas, or if maybe one day you actually travel to another part to actually do work. There is different types of grass species, and they will germinate under different types of conditions. We have what's known as warm season grasses or cool season grasses, and based on when you put them in the ground, how warm or cold it is determines whether or not they actually germinate. Obviously here in Hawaii, you're going to be dealing pretty much with warm season grasses, unless maybe you are up high in the elevation on maybe the main island or something on Hawaii. But this is predominantly what you're going to be dealing with. But I just wanted to throw this out there and give you a little bit more information. Different types of methods for planting seed. I look at it in 3 different ways. Drill seeding is probably your most the one that's going to give your best chances for germination. And the reason being is it puts the seed into the ground. That's the best place for that seed to be. It's in the ground, it's where the moisture is, it's where the nutrients is, it's safely away from any types of little critters and birds and stuff that could possibly remove it. Also, the chances are reduced that water will take it downstream. Maybe it's not something that's used here often, but it is an option. I know the Soil Conservation Service uses drill seeding a lot. That's their primary way of doing any type of stabilization with seed. Broadcast is a little bit different. I'm not a big fan of broadcasting because to me you don't get an even application of seed over an area. You tend to have higher concentrations in some areas versus other. Also, because the seeds are placed on top of the ground, there's the chance of removal by insects, birds, all those little critters that absolutely love it. And on top of it, you may have to use twice the amount of seed for broadcasting as you would drill. So your price starts going up in terms of seed, which seed, in my opinion, is one of the cheapest aspects of erosion control, but still it is something to take into account. And then hydraulic applications is probably the one that you're most familiar with. And all it is it's basically a slurry that's sprayed onto your exposed bare grounds, and the seeds are now found within the mulch medium itself. If it's applied as a one-step application, the seeds are going to have little contact with the soil because it's found suspended within that mulch medium itself. So there is potentially, without the proper irrigation or the proper moisture, there is a chance for less germination to occur. But in arid and semi-arid climates and areas that you're not getting as much moisture, you may have to actually have up to 4 times the drill application rate, so up to 4 times the amount of seed as you would if you use the drill itself. But this works great in areas, especially if you tend to have steeper slopes or areas that you may not be able to get a drill onto. I mean, that's going to be probably your primary way of doing it no matter what. But what we have to realize and what we have to remember is that planting seed alone will not control erosion. Obviously, we need the vegetation to germinate, to grow it, to fill in, and however long that takes to get that 70% of historic vegetation, we're going to have a vulnerable time for that exposed soil. We need that biomass to fill in to help hold the soil. So we have to have that seed in conjunction with other BMPs. And especially as we look at going from flatter areas up and start looking at slopes and steeper slopes, that extra item becomes more and more critical. And so what are some of those items? Well, mulches, and I just started talking about the hydraulic mulch application, but also you could do what I call RECPs, which are rolled erosion control products, or soil binders as well. So we're going to now talk a little bit about the mulches and then move on to soil binders and the rest of them. So hydraulic mulches, and I stuck with the hydraulic mulch because that's what I know you guys use here. Basically, it's a slurry. It's a mixture of a few different components, and the minimal components is going to be some sort of material that helps give it that protection, that coverage to go over the ground to help protect the soil. And it could be a wood fiber, it could be a paper product, but also included in there is a binder. And when I talk about a binder, I'm thinking of a glue, a material that helps glue all that stuff together when it actually dries. You can also include in here fertilizers. So your nutrients that can be added in with the slurry here. And on top of it, this is oftentimes where the seed is put in as well. The application rate is going to be about 1 to 1.5 tons per acre. This is what they've found over the years is going to probably work the best for a traditional hydraulic mulch. But possible problems. A hydraulic mulch is not a perfect BMP. There is no perfect BMP out there. And a problem that I see happen over and over again with mulch applications is what we call shadowing. And this occurs when the mulch is applied from one direction only and you have the fluffiness of the soil sticking up. You create these little shadows. A lot of people say, yeah, that shouldn't be an issue, should it? Actually, it is, because wherever there's soil exposed, that means seed has not gotten onto it. And that also means it's a place where erosion can actually occur. And when we look at slopes, this becomes a place for potential failures, and it can fail. So it's something to be aware of. Now, Does that mean that I would expect somebody to go out with the mulcher on the steep slope, spray it from below, and then somehow climb up that slope and spray it from above? Not necessarily. Safety to me is always key, as well as the ability to actually access the site. But it's something to be aware of and to know that this could cause a failure on the site itself of that hydraulic mulch application. You need to have as close to 100% coverage as possible. Okay? That's the one major downside to a hydraulic mulch application. Soil binders. This to me is a temporary because these things break down. They can break down in a month, they can do a couple months, 6 months, just depending on the climate, how robust the material is, and where it's being applied and everything that goes with it. So I mentioned it before when I was talking about the binder and the hydraulic mulch. Basically all it is a glue. That's all this is, and it glues the soil particles together. Sometimes they may put a little bit of a fiber in with it, but oftentimes all you see is just this liquid slurry sprayed out on top of the bare ground. How well does it work? It works pretty good if it's applied in the right application, but there's limitations. We don't want to see vehicle traffic on it. We don't want to see people walking on it because it will break down and break down a lot quicker. And then just recognizing the longevity of it can be compromised by continual moisture. And also knowing when to apply it. In some cases, these need to be applied in dry conditions. But it can be something that can be used for a temporary erosion control. So we don't have to break out the full hydraulic mulch. We don't have to break out the blankets, the seed. It can be applied alone. And so this could be one of those where you're not in there for the temporary cessation. You know, you're not going to be in there for more than 14 days, but maybe it'll be a month, maybe it'll be a 2 month. You can spray this and help reduce the erosion potential. Rolled erosion control products. This is the big title, so RECPs, and in it is included the multiple different items that make up the blanket world. I look at it, I break it down into two different types. What I call erosion control blankets, and some people refer to them as erosion control mats. These tend to be your lighter weight. Most of the time they're made out of an organic material, and I'm actually going to go into these a little bit more, so I'm just going to point this out here. So it tends to be an organic material, and it can be a net or a netless material. The other one is turf reinforcement mats, your TRMs. These are a more robust material. These tend to be meant for short term. They're going, you're going to degrade over time. You're relying on the vegetation to become established, and is what's going to control the erosion. Turf reinforcement mats are robust, and in many cases are meant there for the long term. They're a permanent solution. So erosion control blankets or mats themselves, I tend to see these used, and when I design them or look at them being put on a site, they're on the hillsides. Because I would hope that in a lot of cases, if you have runoff coming down that is so concentrated that you need more than vegetation, that has already been taken into account in the design phase, and a very formal structure is done. Otherwise, hillsides, you should be able to get away with the vegetation in most cases. So I know this is going to degrade over time. The thing with erosion control blankets are that they come in a number of different flavors, and they have a lot of different longevity, whether or not it's a very short term or whether it can last a couple years. And that's maybe dependent upon where you use it or how you end up using it. But it assists with the vegetation establishment. Some of the different types out there, like I said, I was going to kind of show you some of the different options. Like I said, organic, you can end up, one product is an Excelsior type blanket there. Note that in this case, we just are showing an example that it has an inorganic netting. So the Excelsior will biodegrade. The netting will remain for a much longer period. So something to be aware of. The straw, they have just straight straw blankets. This one, in this case, has an organic netting that we're just illustrating there. That means the whole blanket will degrade over time, and it's 100% vegetation that is going to have to become established. Coconut or coir, a little bit more robust than straw in my opinion. Straw breaks down very quickly compared to coconut. I've had good luck with Excelsior in more humid and areas that get a lot more rainfall. I've had less luck in it in the drier areas. It's just something about the product itself. It's not a bad product, but just know the limitations. And then a combination of a straw coconut. What I find happens with this material is the straw degrades quicker, the coconut remains longer, and in this case we have an inorganic netting there, and then the netting ends up staying there. It's just one different type out there, one option. The other one is your netless erosion control blankets, and this one was a newer one for me in recent years because I'm so used to the ones that have the netting in it. I had to really kind of step back and think about how this works. This one is an Excelsior product. You can see a filament in there, but there's no actual net itself. It can be Excelsior, it can be recycled wood fibers. Like this one, there's no filaments, there's no netting involved in this one. How well they work, I've not had as much experience with these, so I can't give you a good feel how they would work in more humid climates, but it's something to think of and ask about. But the goal with hillside stabilization is soil prep, seeding, proper matting equals proper stabilization. This is the cleanest way, the best way, in my opinion, to really get a good establishment, a good stabilization on a slope. Is it the only way? Absolutely not. Is it more expensive? There's a little more labor in it, a little more time, but we're not so much worried about material like hydromulches getting damaged, degrading over time. It's an option. Turf reinforcement mats. I tend to see these used in drainage channel. The reason is, as I mentioned, they're robust. They're meant for the long haul. They're meant to be there permanently. They're meant to carry heavier flows in the channel. They're meant for places where vegetation alone cannot handle the flows that could come down that channel itself. But it gives you the vegetation instead of having to use concrete or rock. It's a non-degradable product, so it's going to be their long-term polyethylene, polyurethane. So different aspects, different options on how to use it. Some cases they have the non-degradable netting, the rigid netting, but they may have a degradable matrix found within it. And you can see how thick this fabric can actually be, at least about 1/4 inch in thickness. But proper design is critical. To me, a contractor, unless they have the knowledge and have the design background, should not be picking a TRM. It should go back to the designer because you have to take into account shear stresses and velocities. Okay, diversion structures. Basically, these are an erosion control entity. Is it something that helps with stabilization? Not really. It's meant to divert runoff around sensitive areas. It's meant to take maybe a lot of water, and instead of having it go down a slope, instead we try and take it to a certain point and maybe transition it down via like a slope drain or something along that line. But it helps by reducing the erosion in certain areas, by reducing the amount of runoff that goes there. But we need to be careful because we need to make sure that maybe a dirt channel is not going to be enough. Maybe we need some actual lining. It might not be hard armoring. Maybe it's a plastic. Maybe it's a blanket. Temporary, but also we need to be aware of where that actually discharges. You may need stabilization, but we also just need to be aware of how it discharges and where it actually discharges to. Slope drains, basically they're meant to collect runoff from areas. It could be from a watershed area, you know, a larger basin. It could be off the edges of roadways. But what it's trying to do is transition the runoff from the top of the slope to the bottom. And oftentimes I see these used in conjunction with that earthen berm. So you have an earthen berm at the top here. It channelizes the runoff to this point, and then we transition it down the slope. Reduces the chance for erosion to actually occur on the hillside itself. It can work great to save the slopes. It is time consuming. We have to make sure that the appropriate size slope drains piping is actually used and the spacing is correct. And then the last one is check structures. Check structures, typically when they're installed in the construction process, used when we have the channels being developed and everything, are a sediment control structure. However, when we install them at the end of construction, we know that they're meant to be part of the long-term project, you know, post-construction down the road. Then they actually are looking at using them for erosion control. But what I see happen so often is a BMP is placed and it's just meant for show and tell. It actually provides very little benefit at all. Think about how much volume is actually going to be captured behind this one. Not a whole lot. Okay, and depending on how much area actually drains to it, this could possibly be overwhelmed over and over and over again. Silt fence barriers I don't look at as a check structure. It's very hard to install them correctly, and oftentimes they're just used in the wrong location there. But when they are put in, they can work. But to me, this is a temporary structure. This is a temporary structure. If you're looking at them for erosion control, they should be long-term. But the way it works is, the idea is we're trying to slow down the velocity of the water. So we're trying to flatten out the channel. So we put permanent structures in, or even temporary, but the structures create these little plateaus of material that has built up. And the way that they work and work successfully, and this is where it has to be checked in the field, is the top of the downstream structure is in line with the bottom of the upstream structure. That's the only way these work. Otherwise, you get the enhanced erosion in the channel itself, which adds more material into the runoff water. Okay. This here, I'm just throwing it up just to show that spacing is critical and to be aware of it. Just because on every project a designer keeps putting check structures at 50 feet apart, doesn't matter the slope of the channel or whatever, that means that they're not considering the true function of it. 2% channel slope, the spacing of an 18-inch high barrier would be about 75 feet apart. So that means you have one here, 75 feet up the channel would be the next one. That would give you that plateau. 2% slope, not very steep. Let's go up to 7%. That same height, 18 inches, we're down to 20 feet apart. Okay? So right there, all of a sudden, we've increased the number of check structures that have to be installed within the channel itself. Increase the price, increase the maintenance, so be aware of it. Maybe a TRM might be better. But when they work, and when they work well, they can be very effective. Okay? So just kind of summary. Why do we do erosion control during construction? Obviously, it reduces the maintenance, meaning it reduces the maintenance on the sediment control, because we're hopefully not relying on them as heavily, and they might be able to be removed a lot quicker. It minimizes the sediment discharge. Obviously, it protects the environment. And in the end, it really does save the contractor money when we get these areas stabilized, because they're not having to go back and repair rills, repair gullies, reseed, reapply, clean up downstream where the material might have collected. So long-term cost benefits. Okay. All right.